about psychotherapeutic use of psychedelics and the lack thereof in this country and in other countries. Do you foresee an increase of that with the decline of the nation state and the rise of the World Wide Web, as you've sort of laid it out?
A rise in psychedelic therapy?
Well, because from what I understood of what you were saying, one of the main reasons why that's been marginalized and pushed under and scheduled to the degree that it's been scheduled is because the nation state, it doesn't serve the nation state to have psychedelic activity going on a large scale. And so if nation states in the next 15 to 20 years go on the decline and are marginalized in their power and scope, and either corporations or global community take over, do you foresee a rise in psychedelic use in the medical
Yeah, I think so. I think, we talked about the world corporate entity that's emerging, that the world is being replaced from 200 nations to 1,000 corporations. The values are very different. Corporations are not particularly interested in suppressing dissent in quite the same way that nations are, because corporations don't argue their existence from a philosophical position. The other thing is corporations hate unregulated markets. And so I can imagine, drugs are a commodity, an enormous money-making engine. And it would be better for everyone, cynics, users, purists, manufacturers, physicians, governments, if drugs were simply an ordinary commodity, and if abuse of drugs was treated like any other mental aberration. Simply, you would be dumped into the mental health care system for treatment rather than criminalized and humiliated. It would be much cheaper for health care management and the legal system to treat it this way. Essentially, the situation now, the reason drugs are so severely repressed when it's such a money-losing proposition to do that is because the nation state is carrying out a vestigial obligation to the church, to Central European Calvinism. The reason drugs are illegal is because they're evil, fundamentally. Well, I think the corporate state will move beyond such theological claptrap and just say, well, they may be evil, but so is pornography, so are a lot of things that we traffic in with great gusto. The shift to the world corporate state is an ambiguous thing. The nation state used war as an instrument of national policy. Corporations don't do that. Yes, there is a large trade in armaments, and those arms are created by corporations, but armament trade is a small percentage of overall global economic activity. The world could live without corporations that produce armaments, and so could capitalism. The world corporate state is unfriendly to racism. In fact, it doesn't like any kind of boundary definitions in the customer class. It wants everybody to think of themselves as Joe Normal with the buying patterns and tastes of Joe Normal. What are the other differences? Well, it's non-ideological. All the world corporate state wants to do is pick your pocket, which when you think of the political agendas we've survived in the 20th century, somebody who just wants to pick your pocket doesn't exactly sound too bad. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a difficult question because of when you have corporations, you have things that have to be manufactured. I've been dealing with the uprising in Chiapas. Somebody has to make the stuff. There is a point where there are uprisings, and where it is shut down, where there is great violence that occurs. We don't hear about it.
You mean violence at the behest of corporatism?
Indeed.
Yes, but it's nothing
and we have a
like,
record of it. I mean,
it's
if you go to the
nothing like
library,
erasing the cities of Europe by aerial bombing or something like that. I agree. There's a low level of
it may be low level. It seems fairly high level where, a company will go in and say, Guatemala is becoming socialist. Let's go to the law firm. We'll hire the lawyers. They'll get in touch with the political people, and we'll go down there and, assassinate whoever so that United Fruit can continue. That's just, an easy example.
Well, if assassination is a tool of corporate statecraft, I've always sort of leaned toward assassination. Have you ever noticed how few innocent people get ground up in assassinations? I mean, if someone had assassinated Saddam Hussein, those 100,000 Iraqi soldiers who were buried alive in the pits in the desert might have lived to tell the tale to their grandchildren. But governments are horrified by assassination. Oh, Lord, no, you would never do that. The entire fabric of diplomatic understandings established since the Congress of Vienna would come unglued. Far better to conscript 1 million 18-year-olds and send them off to try to kill the leader by the fair rules of international diplomacy. The question, capitalism is so triumphant now that its salvation will probably have to be self-generated. In other words, it's not going to come from slave uprisings or a papal encyclical, or it's simply that capitalism is going to have to grow smarter. And they're trying to do this. And once they smarten beyond a certain point, they will carry out what is essentially a Marxist analysis of their own situation and realize we can't keep doing this because the open system of exploitable natural resources that we are assuming doesn't exist anymore. And we can't lift everybody to the level of the American middle class without cutting down every tree and digging every vein of metal on the planet. Now there are always, as I've tried to stress in this weekend, there are always technological fixes. And it may be that there will be a technological fix for this as well. One thing we haven't talked about it at all, maybe it's been mentioned, but certainly not unpacked, is nanotechnology. Nanotechnology is something as mind-boggling as the internet or psychedelic drugs, and it isn't exactly related to either one of them. You all know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about these people, many of whom are clustered down in Cambridge and Boston, who propose that we're on the brink of an entirely new way of making things, that things can be made from the atoms up in chemical soups, that everything should be as small as possible. And these are people who have gotten, 1,500 steam engines onto a 1-centimeter chip. The cover of Scientific American a few years ago had this 1 centimeter chip with over 1,500 steam engines on it. More steam engines than were operating in England at the height of the age of steam. Now, of course, each one of these steam engines produced 1/10,000th of a millinewton of force. Not much, but at the molecular level, enough to kick a tiny molecular gear into action or throw a switch or something like that. Nanotechnology is coming. It's so mind-boggling that they haven't spent any money on public relations, in other words, getting the people ready. So very few people realize how close this is. I mean, the AI may be off in the mists of time. Practical nanotechnology is already here. They make electric motors, 16 of which can fit inside a human hair. And what's envisioned is a world of aerosol dusts that are architected machines that are creeping over our bodies, through our bloodstream, in our houses, inside our larger machines. And everything is made of diamond, because diamond is the easiest material to manipulate at the atomic level. The holy grail of nanotechnology is something called a matter compiler. A matter compiler has its nose in a muddy ditch or an ocean estuary or something like that, and it essentially does to matter what Photoshop 5.0 does to images. Anything you want. So what's being brought in is a kind of sludge-like raw feed. It could be, in fact, in the nanotechnological future, the great real estate bonanzas will be toxic dumps. Because there you will send the nanotechnologically designed bacterial machines into the dumps, and they'll bring out the gold, the platinum, the phosphorus, the arsenic, atom by atom, and stack it up for you. You can have a closed resource cycle based on the standing crop of already extracted metals. People talk about abandoning agriculture. Because the populations of India and China will be fed out of matter compilers that turn seawater directly into rice. This could be done. How do we feel about that? Are we willing to give up agriculture if it means an entirely artificial food cycle for us, but the restoration of millions of acres of forest and prairie and meadow and grassland? These kinds of choices lie in the immediate future. Yeah.
When do time machines arrive from the future?
The question of time machines. Well, this relates to the speculation about the singularity. One scenario for envisioning the singularity at the end of time would be, here we've had this graph, which for millions of years has described the unfolding of process. And then at 2012, at this certain date in 2012, it reaches infinity, or it stops working. In any case, it indicates novelty becomes maximized at infinity, and then there is no more time. Well, trying to imagine various scenarios which would destroy time or obsolete time, one is a technology for moving through time. The literal annihilation of time by vehicular traversing of it. Time machines have a checkered intellectual history. Some people claim, with good reason, they're impossible. Other people claim they're only impossible under certain conditions. What's usually put against a time machine theory is what's called the grandfather paradox. The grandfather paradox is, if I had a time machine and I traveled into the past, I could kill my grandfather. Then I wouldn't exist. Then I wouldn't have a time machine. Then I couldn't travel into the past. So how could I kill my grandfather? So this apparent logical contradiction is used to say that the travel is impossible. Notice it doesn't restrict travel forward, in the forward direction. In quantum physics, it's routine to handle, to send charges and qualities backward through time in these equations. And people have always said, well, it's just a mathematical convention. It doesn't really mean anything in the real world. Well, but how do we know? We don't know. As we approach the speed of light, according to Einstein's theory of relativity, time slows to nothingness. At the speed of light, time is at zero, eternity. If you were a photon, you would have no notion of time at all, but the universe would appear to be aging wildly around you, but you would have no sense of time passing. Are time travel technologies possible? A lot of people are beginning to think so. Some of them require almost godlike technologies. In other words, if you could spin a cylinder whose radius was that of the planet Saturn and whose longitudinal length was 10 times that, if you could spin it at the speed of light and you traversed its perpendicular axis, theory indicates you would be spun into the past. Well, we can't even dream of technologies like that, but it seems to indicate that in principle these things can be done. Some people believe there are black holes in the universe or wormholes that might be potential doorways to other dimensions. The wormhole theorists calculate what kind of energies it would take to pry open the mouth of one of these wormholes and hold it open long enough to push some information down it. Well, its materials, orders of magnitude more tensile in their strength than anything we can produce, but still not inconceivable in some far-flung future. My notion about a time machine is that it's not what it looks like. If you had a time machine and you used it and it worked, I think it would actually have the effect of causing the rest of the history of the local universe to happen instantly, because it would collapse the local assumption of a symmetrically evolving dimension. What I mean by that is, in order to keep the grandfather, well, here's the idea. Suppose you had a time machine that you had never used. You were the inventor of the first time machine. And on a certain day, you used it and sailed off into time, the future. Well, then the presumption would be, since you're the inventor of the first time machine, that just moments after that event, time machines from all points in the future would converge on your departure point. People who would come back to see the first voyage into time. This is presuming a universe where you can travel back into time, but only as far as the invention of the first time machine. This is the kind of universe I think we're living in, for no good reason other than this is what the mushroom told me. I said, is time travel possible? And it said yes, and I said into the future, and it said yes, and I said into the past, and it said only as far into the past as the moment of the invention of the first time machine. I said why, and it said because before that there were no time machines. Duh. So in that kind of a universe, when you sail back in time and get to keep the grandfather paradox from happening, I think all the rest of time happens instantly. So it becomes more like a God whistle, more like some kind of evolutionary fast-forward button, where you're somewhere in the historical continuum messing around with technology and society and this and that. Then you invent a time machine and zip, the rest of history happens in the next few milliseconds as the whole thing goes nova.